The betrayal of Jesus by Judas Iscariot is one of the most well-known and shocking stories in the Bible. It is found in all four Gospels and is remembered as a powerful example of disloyalty. Judas was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, someone close to him, trusted, and part of his inner circle. Despite this closeness, Judas chose to betray Jesus. The reasons vary in the Gospel accounts. Some say he was tempted by money. Others suggest Satan entered him. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Judas handed over Jesus to be arrested and eventually crucified. During the Last Supper, Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples. It was during this meal that Jesus made a chilling statement. "One of you will betray me." Though he did not name Judas outright, he clearly knew what was about to happen. After the meal, Judas went to the religious leaders who wanted Jesus arrested. He agreed to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Judas knew Jesus often went to pray in a quiet garden called Gethsemane, so he led the soldiers there. To identify Jesus in the dark, Judas told them, "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." He approached Jesus, greeted him, and gave him a kiss, a sign of both affection and betrayal. Jesus looked at him and said, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" At that moment, the soldier stepped forward to arrest Jesus. One of the disciples, Peter, tried to defend Jesus by cutting off a servant's ear. But Jesus immediately healed the man and told Peter to put away his sword, explaining that this was all part of what the scriptures had foretold. Jesus willingly allowed himself to be taken. Judas's betrayal was not just an act of personal treachery, it triggered the events that would lead to Jesus' trial and crucifixion. Samson was God's chosen man during the time when judges ruled Israel. From birth, he was set apart to deliver Israel from the Philistines and was gifted with supernatural strength. But while Samson was strong physically, he was weak in character, especially when it came to women. One of his greatest downfalls came through a Philistine woman named Delilah. Samson fell deeply in love with Delilah. Seeing an opportunity, the Philistine rulers came to her with an offer. Find out the secret to Samson's strength, and they'd pay her handsomely. Delilah agreed. She made Samson a lovely meal and gently asked him the source of his power. Samson lied and said if he were tied with fresh bowstrings, he'd become weak. She tied him up while he slept and called the Philistines, but he broke free with ease. Delilah tried again. Samson gave her another false answer. Again, she attempted the trap, and again, he escaped. Delilah, growing frustrated and emotional, questioned his love for her. She nagged him day after day until Samson finally gave in, telling her the truth. His strength came from God, and if his hair was cut, he would become weak. That night, as Samson slept, Delilah cut his hair. She called the Philistines, and this time, Samson was powerless. They seized him, gouged out his eyes, and threw him into prison. Later, the Philistines brought Samson out for entertainment at a massive temple filled with thousands. But his hair had begun to grow back, and in that moment, Samson prayed to God for one last surge of strength. He leaned against the temple pillars and, with all his might, pushed them down, killing himself and thousands of Philistines, including their rulers. In the end, despite Samson's failures and betrayal by someone he loved, God still used him to fulfill his purpose. Through Samson's death, the Israelites were delivered from Philistine oppression. Cain and Abel were the first sons of Adam and Eve. Cain worked the land as a farmer, while Abel was a shepherd who cared for the family's flocks. Both brothers decided to bring an offering to the Lord. Cain brought some of the crops he had grown, and Abel brought the best portions of the firstborn from his flock. God accepted Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's. The Bible doesn't say exactly why, but it's clear that Abel's gift came from a place of honor, faith, and wholehearted devotion, while Cain's may have been given out of obligation. Whatever the reason, God's response lit a fire of jealousy and anger in Cain. Instead of reflecting on his heart and actions, Cain allowed bitterness to grow. God warned him, saying, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." But Cain didn't listen. In a calculated act of betrayal, Cain lured Abel into the field and murdered him. This wasn't a fight or an accident. Cain took his brother's life out of envy, knowing full well what he was doing. When God asked Cain where Abel was, Cain responded with the now infamous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" God already knew the truth. As punishment, he cursed Cain so that the ground would no longer yield crops for him. Cain would become a restless wanderer, marked by guilt and shame. But even in judgment, God showed mercy. He placed a mark on Cain to protect him, promising that no one would kill him. Joseph was one of 12 sons of Jacob, and he was deeply loved by their father, so much so that Jacob gave him a special robe of many colors. This favoritism didn't go unnoticed. Joseph also had dreams that showed his brothers bowing to him, and instead of keeping them to himself, he shared them. That only made things worse. His brothers grew bitter and jealous. One day, when Joseph came to check on them in the fields, they saw their chance. At first, they plotted to kill him, but instead, they threw him into a pit. Then, seeing a caravan of traders passing by, they decided to sell him into slavery. They dipped his colorful robe in animal blood and took it to their father, letting him believe Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Joseph ended up in Egypt as a servant, then a prisoner, but God was with him. Through a series of divine events, Joseph rose to power, becoming second in command in Egypt, overseeing food storage during a famine. Years later, his brothers came to Egypt seeking food. They didn't recognize Joseph, but he recognized them. After testing their hearts, Joseph finally revealed himself, not with revenge, but with forgiveness. He told them, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Instead of punishing them, he embraced them and provided for them and their families. David was once Saul's most loyal servant. After David defeated Goliath, he became a hero in Israel. Saul brought him into the royal court, and David served him faithfully, playing music to soothe Saul's troubled spirit and winning battles for the kingdom. At first, Saul admired David, but as the people began singing, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands," Saul's admiration turned into jealousy and fear. He saw David not just as a servant, but as a threat to his throne. What followed was a slow but clear betrayal. Saul tried to kill David multiple times, throwing a spear at him while he played the harp and sending him on dangerous missions, hoping he'd die in battle. When that didn't work, Saul openly began hunting David down like a criminal. David fled for his life even though he had done nothing wrong. He had several chances to kill Saul in self-defense, but he refused, saying, "I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed." Despite Saul's betrayal, David showed mercy. Eventually, Saul's reign ended in tragedy, but David's patience, loyalty, and refusal to retaliate proved his character. David was known as a man after God's own heart. He was a warrior, a worshiper, and a king chosen by God. But even the greatest of leaders can fall, and David's betrayal of Uriah is one of the most tragic stories in the Bible. It began when David stayed home from battle while his men were off fighting. One evening, he saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba bathing from his rooftop. He learned she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his most loyal soldiers. But that didn't stop him. David sent for her, slept with her, and she became pregnant. Instead of confessing his sin, David tried to cover it up. He called Uriah home from battle, hoping he would sleep with his wife, so the child would appear to be his. But Uriah, full of integrity, refused to enjoy comfort while his fellow soldiers were still at war. David's desperation grew darker. He wrote a letter to his military commander, instructing him to put Uriah at the front lines and then pull back so he would be killed. And in a chilling twist, he sent the letter by Uriah himself, a man carrying his own death sentence, completely unaware. Uriah was killed in battle, just as David planned. After a short mourning period, David married Bathsheba. But God saw everything. The prophet Nathan confronted David, exposing his sin. Though David repented and was forgiven, the consequences were severe. The child died, and David's household was never the same. Absalom was one of King David's sons, known for his charm, striking appearance, and ambition. But beneath the surface, resentment and pride were growing, feelings that would eventually lead to one of the most heartbreaking betrayals in the Bible, a son turning against his father. The trouble began after the tragic incident involving Absalom's sister, Tamar, who was abused by their half-brother Amnon. When David failed to take strong action, Absalom took justice into his own hands, killing Amnon. Afterward, he fled into exile. Eventually, David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but their relationship remained distant. Absalom, feeling overlooked and angry, began to steal the hearts of the people. He stood at the city gate listening to their problems and subtly undermining David's leadership by saying, "If only I were judge in the land." It was a slow and calculated betrayal. Absalom gathered support, declared himself king, and forced David to flee Jerusalem in shame. David left barefoot and weeping, betrayed not by a rival, but by his own son. Despite the rebellion, David never stopped loving Absalom. When the final battle came, he ordered his men, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom." But Absalom was killed in battle, caught by his hair in a tree, and struck down against David's wishes. When David heard the news, he didn't celebrate a victory. He wept bitterly, crying, "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you." Absalom's betrayal is one of the most personal and painful in Scripture. It shows how bitterness can twist ambition, and how even deep love can't always stop betrayal. Yet David's heartbreak reveals a father's unshakable love, even for a son who turned against him. Ahithophel was once one of King David's most trusted advisors. Known for his sharp mind and wise counsel, his advice was so highly regarded that Scripture says it was like hearing directly from God. But during a time of crisis, Ahithophel's loyalty shattered, and he sided with David's greatest enemy. When Absalom rebelled against his father David and declared himself king, Ahithophel made a shocking move. He joined Absalom's camp. This wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Ahithophel had once stood by David's side, helping guide the kingdom. His betrayal cut deep. Some scholars believe this wasn't just about power. Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba, the woman David had taken in scandal. If that connection sparked resentment, Absalom's rebellion gave Ahithophel the perfect moment to strike back. Ahithophel gave ruthless advice to Absalom: sleep with David's concubines in public to shame him, and immediately pursue David to strike him down while he was vulnerable. But God had other plans. David prayed that Ahithophel's counsel would be foolishness, and another advisor, Hushai, loyal to David, offered different advice, causing Absalom to hesitate. That hesitation ruined Ahithophel's strategy. Realizing his advice had been ignored and that the rebellion would likely fail, Ahithophel went home, put his affairs in order, and took his own life. Ahithophel's betrayal wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, calculated, and deeply wounding. He wasn't just a counselor, he was a friend, and David felt the sting. In Psalm 41, verse 9, David mourns, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted who shared my bread, has turned against me." King Joash began his reign on a good path. As a child, he was protected and raised by Jehoiada the priest, who preserved his life when Queen Delilah tried to destroy the royal family. Under Jehoiada's guidance, Joash ruled wisely and led the people in restoring the temple of the Lord. As long as Jehoiada lived, Joash honored God. But everything changed after Jehoiada died. Without the priest's steady influence, Joash fell under the pressure of corrupt officials. He abandoned the temple he once helped restore and turned to idol worship. Worse, when Jehoiada's own son, Zechariah, spoke out against this rebellion and called the people back to God, Joash didn't just ignore him, he ordered his death. In the very courtyard of the Lord's temple, Zechariah was stoned to death by Joash's command. The son of the man who had saved and mentored Joash was murdered in cold blood. As he died, Zechariah cried out, "May the Lord see this and call you to account." This was a betrayal not just of a prophet, but of a father's legacy, of a mentor's kindness, and of God himself. Joash had turned on the very house that gave him a future. In time, God did bring judgment. When Joash was wounded in battle, his own officials conspired against him and killed him in his bed, ironically in revenge for the blood of Zechariah. King Ahab of Israel was no stranger to false prophets. Surrounded by hundreds who told him only what he wanted to hear, Ahab had no real interest in truth, only in affirmation. But there was one prophet who stood apart: Micaiah, a man known for speaking only what the Lord revealed, no matter the cost. When Ahab planned to go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, he gathered his usual prophets, and, unsurprisingly, they all said, "Go, you will succeed." But King Jehoshaphat of Judah, who was partnering with Ahab, asked if there was a prophet of the Lord they could consult. Reluctantly, Ahab admitted there was one, Micaiah, but he hated him, saying, "He never prophesies anything good about me, only bad." Micaiah was brought in. At first, sarcastically, he echoed the other prophets. But when pressed, he delivered God's true word. Ahab would die in battle. He even described a vision where a lying spirit had deceived Ahab's prophets to lead him to ruin. Instead of listening, Ahab rejected the warning, accusing Micaiah of lying. Then he ordered him to be imprisoned and fed only bread and water until he returned. If he returned. Micaiah responded, "If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." Ahab disguised himself in battle, thinking he could outsmart prophecy. But a random arrow struck him between the armor, and he died just as Micaiah had warned. Ahab's betrayal wasn't just political, it was spiritual. He betrayed truth itself, silencing the one voice brave enough to warn him. He chose flattery over faith, lies over life. And in the end, it cost him everything. After King Saul died, his son Ishbosheth became king over Israel, while David ruled Judah. Though Ishbosheth wasn't as strong as his father, he was still the last surviving figure from Saul's royal line, and a political threat to David's rise. Serving under Ishbosheth were two captains of his raiding bands, Baanah and Rechab. They had been loyal soldiers, but as David's power grew and Ishbosheth's grip weakened, their loyalty crumbled. One day, while Ishbosheth was resting in the heat of the day, Baanah and Rechab came to his house under the guise of a peaceful visit. But once inside, they stabbed him in the stomach and killed him in his bed. Then, in a gruesome display, they cut off his head and traveled to David in Hebron, thinking they'd done him a favor. They presented the severed head to David expecting praise and reward, but David was horrified. He remembered how he had once executed the man who claimed to kill Saul, the Lord's anointed. Now here were two men boasting about murdering an innocent man in his own home, a man who had done them no harm. David responded with justice. He ordered that Baanah and Rechab be executed for their treachery. Their hands and feet were cut off, and their bodies were displayed as a warning. Ishbosheth's head, however, was given a proper burial in Abner's tomb. Amnon was the firstborn son of King David, privileged, powerful, and positioned to inherit the throne. But he allowed lust to take control, and his obsession wasn't for a stranger. It was for his own half-sister Tamar. Tamar was the full sister of Absalom, another of David's sons. She was innocent, gentle, and trusted her family. But Amnon, driven by desire and selfishness, became consumed with thoughts of her. Instead of seeking help or fighting temptation, he listened to the twisted advice of his cousin Jonadab, who encouraged him to fake an illness and manipulate their father into sending Tamar to care for him. When Tamar arrived at his home to make food and care for him, Amnon dismissed everyone else. He lured her into his bedroom under the pretense of eating, but once they were alone, he grabbed her and raped her, ignoring her desperate pleas and reasoning. This was more than a sin of passion. It was a deep betrayal of trust, family, and innocence. Tamar came to serve, to show compassion. Amnon responded with violence and cruelty. And when the act was over, his twisted love turned to hatred. He threw her out, humiliating her further. Tamar tore her robe, covered herself in ashes, and lived desolate in her brother Absalom's house. King David was furious but did nothing. Absalom remained silent for a time. But the pain festered. Amnon's betrayal didn't just destroy Tamar, it tore apart David's household, sowing seeds of hatred and revenge that would lead to Absalom murdering Amnon and eventually rebelling against David himself.